What?
Whoop.
Yeah. Let's take that chair away. You stand.
Okay.
Okay. We're gonna start. We're gonna start the forum. Anybody wants to come in?
Oh, yep. Oops, I hit it with my hat. There we go. Just click. There we go.
Okay. We're gonna start the forum. Everybody here at front and center. So I'm David Chris, the junior warden, here to introduce Jayne, who's giving us a part of her dissertation. She received her PhD just this winter, right?
Yep, in June.
And the hat is new.
Yeah, the hat is new.
The border, what's it called? Border?
It's a tam for a dissertation.
A tam, okay. So, glasses over here. But Jayne and her husband Nick, raise your hand, good for you, have been members here for 2.5 years. Her dissertation, as you can see,
It won't go into full mode,
It won't go-
unfortunately. This is as good as we're getting. Yeah, it won't show it when it gets bigger. See? Yep. We're good.
Okay. Well, the Heart of the Nations, Mandan and Hidatsa women.
Yep.
Resistance and Resilience. This is her dissertation for her PhD. She received it from the University of Minnesota in U.S. History and a minor in American, Indian, and Indigenous Studies. Wonderful. And as I said, they've been members here for 2.5 years. So we look forward to it. Thank you. And then she'll be speaking also next week at the forum. A version of this, an extension of this. So it'll be an exciting time next week as well as things come again.
Yeah.
Over to you, Jayne.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, both digitally and in person, for this forum. Father Jeff asked me to come and talk about my research since I was getting my PhD, but also to speak about, this I think will be kind of an ongoing series of people talking about what their vocations are and how they use their gifts that God's given them to minister wherever they are. For me, that's in academia. I've been a history student my whole life. Actually, we'll go on in the presentation for that. Coming to my presentation was pretty natural for me. This little girl with the ponytail in the bull boat, which is a conical boat made out of bull buffalo hide used to float in the Missouri River by Mandan and Hidatsa people traditionally. That's me. During a rendezvous at the Fort Union National Park rendezvous every year when I was just a little girl. I grew up in North Dakota, and my parents, although we are settlers, were Slovakian, Estonian, German, Russian, made sure that I knew Indigenous history and the people whose lands I lived on and who my family worked alongside. One of my earliest memories is going to the North Dakota Heritage Center, which is our state museum, and listening to recordings of a woman named Buffalo Bird Woman. Her interviews that were conducted in the 1920s and teens make up a wonderful book called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. It was published by the Minnesota Historical Society actually back in the 60s, and it's been republished since. It's still in the press if you're interested. She talks about gardening, but she also talks about her way of life and how she grew up in the she was born in 1846, I believe. She lived into the early 1920s. She talks about her childhood, and her granddaughters read parts of her interviews for a North Dakota public broadcasting recording, and they would play this at the Heritage Center in a specific spot. I remember listening to that as a little girl and being so interested in her way of life, but also her experiences. Then when I was about 5 years old, we moved to the Rosebud Reservation, or the edge of the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, where my dad actually got his PhD in a doctorate of ministry degree working with the Lakota community, looking at the effects of generational trauma on church attendance for Lakota folks between the generations. This research, although conducted in 2000, still holds up today, looking at the differences and the impacts of things like boarding schools, like the AIM movement, like just the poverty that exists on reservations, as well as the resilience of people. I went along on those interviews. I didn't know they were interviews, but my dad quickly learned that when you bring a little girl with you, you aren't coming as someone that could be CPS, you aren't coming as someone that could be a repo man, you're coming as a member of the community. So when I read my dad's dissertation back, I read quotes like, oh, I remember that quote. I was playing with Paige, or I was playing with Brittany, my friends. But my dad was talking to their uncle or their grandma, and I was part of that community. But growing up in that space, I thought everyone knew Native American history. So when I went to school in Indiana, actually where I met Nick, I wasn't going to look at Indigenous history. Everyone knows that, right? So I decided I was going to look at way long ago, like Visigoths and tribal history in the Roman Empire. Well, when I was in Indiana, I wasn't there one day before I heard someone say something horribly racist, completely unintentionally. And I went, okay, not everyone knows this history, but I can make a difference in that. So I switched my focus to looking at Native American history, only person at my college that was doing that. And I decided, let's focus on how people tell their own stories, and especially highlighting the work of women. That's how I got to my project. But it doesn't quite explain what I'm looking at. So in my research, I decided to focus on women and the ways that women are resilient, the ways that women lead their communities through periods of change. And originally I thought, oh, I'll look at the Rosebud. That's where I grew up, that's where I have family. But I talked to a couple of dear family friends, and at that point they said, I was not married, they said, you know what, don't go back to the Rosebud. We have enough issues with drugs, we have enough issues with trafficking. It's not safe for a single woman to be driving around knocking on doors alone. I listened to that. Well, that's one of the first lessons I learned as a little girl. You listen to your elders. You listen to what they say, because their words come with wisdom. So I decided, until that's lifted, I'm not going to go back to Rosebud. But then I started thinking about other communities I interact with. I started to think about when I lived in North Dakota in high school, or in middle school and high school. We lived in the city of Bismarck, which is not a city by Minnesota standards, but it is by North Dakota standards. I thought of a woman named Jackie Bearsdale. Jackie is no longer with us, unfortunately, but she is the mother of one of my dear friends from middle school and high school, Walter. She and her husband, Daryl, worked with my dad while my dad was the administrator of a Christian school called Shiloh. They talked to my dad about this gap in the Bismarck school system. Indigenous students from the different reservations were coming to Bismarck for better school opportunities, or because their parents had moved to Bismarck for education for themselves or for work opportunities. But the racism that exists in the Bismarck school system made it very hard to thrive and survive in Bismarck. So Jackie and Daryl went to my dad and said, we need to find a way to change this. Small Christian private school had the opportunity to make a difference. They, alongside working with my dad, Jackie and Daryl, as well as many other community members, worked to get donors to make a scholarship for Indigenous students to come to our little school. They've worked on having a thriving basketball program, thriving track program, to give students something that they could do and plug into, and then have a space that they could be supported, that they could be taught very highly academic school, while also being supported as being who they are. That their identity as Indigenous students were not a polar opposite to being at a Christian school or to receiving a high education. Jackie, when I think of a woman who's a leader, I think of Jackie. And not only does she inspire my project, the reason why there's purple throughout this project is one of her favorite colors, but she was my first point of contact. You see, Jackie Hall Bearsdale is a member of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations. These are two nations in North Dakota. If you would look at a map of North Dakota, it's kind of just a square, but there's the Missouri River that flows through it. That Missouri River land has always been the homelands of the Mandan and Hidatsa. These two nations are not buffalo traveling nations like many others, like the Dakota. They haven't had a long migration story like the Anishinaabe here in Minnesota. The Mandan said that they were created along the Missouri River and have always been there. Our earliest archaeological evidence supports their claim that they are from the Missouri River. We have the oldest village evidence all point to being Mandan ancestors. The Hidatsa came from someplace further east, possibly Devil's Lake area, more likely somewhere even here in Minnesota, possibly moving out as the Anishinaabe and Dakota came over here, joining the Mandan along the river. These people build permanent homes or semi-permanent homes. These earth lodges, they're circular dwellings of earth, kind of like a sod house with a willow frame and posts around the center. You'll see a picture of that in the middle, later in the presentation. And they gardened. They grow corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, which made them pivotal points of trade throughout this whole Northern Plains area. We have evidence of their crops all the way almost to the East Coast, all the way to the West Coast. Also, their communities were around areas where you can mine flint, which is a stone that you use to make arrowheads, used to make tools. There's evidence of Knife River flint from the Knife River, which is one of the tributaries of Missouri, where the largest Hidatsa village was. We found Knife River flint up into Alberta, almost all the way to Washington. We've also found shells and elk teeth and things that would have come from Nez Perce tribes over in Washington and Oregon coming and trading or coming through their allies along the Missouri. These nations have always been hubs of trade and hubs of community. And although through the reservation system, allotment system, and things that the US government has imposed on these nations, they continue to be tight-knit communities. Both of these nations now, along with the Samish, which is a Pawnee relative that came out of Central America way back, they now all live on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. But they continue to be models of community support, community relationship, as well as essential points of trade and economics for Indigenous communities. Today, it's not corn, soybeans, and shells, it's oil. They're part of the Bakken oil field. They have some of the most developed oil industry in Indigenous America. You also, they have some of the most cutting edge use of geothermal and wind and solar power as well, because they've seen the boom and bust system that is being an oil dependent area, and they found ways to address that. And then the money from oil land that's reservation held goes back into elders housing, drug and alcohol recovery, school and education to continue to support the community long after this oil boom is done. That's the people that Daryl and Jackie are from. And that's the type of thing that I think of when I think of leadership. So I went and I talked to Jackie, well, went meaning I messaged her on Facebook, as we often do, and asked her, would you be interested in me looking at Mandan and Hidatsa history? Would this be helpful for you? Got a message back right away. It's like, I remember you. I know who you are, which is always a relief when you're messaging a friend of someone from middle school, when you're now in your doctoral program. And then said, absolutely, thank you for remembering women. So Jackie became the start of my presentation and my research. She talked to her sister Diane, who I'm actually going to be visiting probably on Tuesday, because I'm going to go back and give copies of my dissertation to everyone that I interviewed. And Diane sent Jackie back phone numbers of people I could call, and started my snowball of interacting with people. And then COVID hit, unfortunately. So things had to change, but once vaccines were around, my interviews went from being Zoom and texting to being able to go to North Dakota and interview people in their communities. And I saw how deep this web of relationships is, this web of kinship, this network that women have built historically and today, and how that supports their community. So that's what I look at. So there's some obvious limitations for things. First of all, comparing my work compares leadership historically, because I'm a historian. I look at the time between 1837 and 1950. 1837, there was a massive smallpox epidemic that just decimated the Northern Plains. It was unintentionally brought up the river on the steamboat, the St. Peter's. There were some crew and some passengers that were ill. They didn't inform anyone because they still wanted to unload their cargo, and ended up causing a smallpox epidemic at every steamboat stop up the Missouri. You can actually track it in traders' diaries. We know exactly when it started. It was the beginning of July 1837 in the big Mandan village. at the Fort Clark site, which is just a little bit north of Washburn, North Dakota today. And it continued, it ended up spreading out throughout western Great Plains area, but also did spread this way. But at that same time, the Dakota War kind of acted as a buffer, no one really coming this way. And then I focused on interviews that were conducted with women that lived through that epidemic, or their mothers and grandmothers did in the 1920s. Gilbert Wilson is an anthropologist, a Presbyterian minister and an anthropologist who was getting his doctorate in the 1920s from what was a precursor of one of the universities here in the Twin Cities. It wasn't University of Minnesota, but it was another one. He was working with the Hay Museum, which would become the National Natural History Museum in New York, as a purchaser of collections, because this is in that period where anthropologists were so interested in stopping nations from disappearing, so they were going to go and buy all of their sacred things and all of their special things and take them to New York to be safe. That's a can of worms that we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But he went and he conducted interviews with women, because women are the keepers of knowledge. These are matrilineal societies. That means that you belong to the family that your mother is from, and that knowledge is transferred through maternal lines. Your mother's brothers are more significant in your life than your dad during your living life. After death, your father's family does the ceremony and everything and cares for you after death, but during life, it's your mother's family. So women have always been the heart of their nation and the teachers. So he listened to women and conducted interviews with them, mostly because he wanted to know what the stories were that went with the stuff he was buying. But it ended up becoming one of the strongest records of women's lives from that era. I wanted to take the leadership that I see in those records, as well as court records and other things from that era, and putting them in conversation today, because the women that I was talking to are the great-granddaughters or the great-great-granddaughters of those women, and they can all tell me exactly who. So I asked them about their leadership. How are you leading as a teacher, as a mother, as a language teacher, as the tribal college president, as a lawmaker? And seeing how the same ethics and the same ethos of leadership that was developed time immemorial, that women talk about their grandmothers having in the 1830s, that they talk about having in the 1920s, are the same things I hear from women now. And tracing that long line of leadership, despite many efforts of the US, despite the boarding school system, despite displacement on reservations, despite the destruction of 90% of the land on the reservation because of the construction of Garrison Dam, these women continue to lead and these stories go on. I also made sure that as I went, I kept my delicate relationship in mind. I am from that area, but I am not from there. I am a settler. My family came in, some came on the Mayflower, but most came in the 1900s as homesteaders, escaping Stalin's purges in Russia, escaping famine and other issues. So I wanted to make sure that I talked to people and I had permission, not only from my university, going through official permissions, but from the Tribal Preservation Office to make sure that this would be helpful for the community, but also with everybody I talked to. Instead of coming in with a million questions, although of course I have those in my back pocket as a researcher, I asked them, what should I know? When you think about leadership, what do you want me to know? And I went off of their stories. I let women tell me stories. Oftentimes I didn't even have a tape recorder going because it was more important for us to be in a conversation and for me to frantically write it down as soon as I got to my car afterwards than to disrupt our relationship with me frantically looking at my computer to type or having to stop and start a tape player constantly. Because those relationships are more important than what we might consider like academic method. So now into what I actually wrote about. My dissertation is divided into 5 chapters. I'll just go over briefly their content as we go through. If anyone's interested in my dissertation, I now have permission to send it to people. So I can send it to you via email on PDF if you want. It's like 308 pages or something. So fair warning, it's a doozer. But my thesis, what I ended up arguing in this, is that Mandan and Hidatsa women have always been community leaders and engaged in their worlds. They are instrumental in the MHA nations, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations' resistance, resilience, and adaptation. Through networks of kinship and trade, intergenerational teaching, political leadership, they adapt their material, social, and spiritual cultures to incorporate new contexts and materials and assess their place in the world. This is a lot of words to say. Women have always been leaders, and they continue to be leaders, no matter what they faced and no matter what circumstance they find themselves in. This is the teachery language of that. So my first chapter starts back in the 1837 epidemic, that women are the heart of their families. Anything that you see in titles with the quotes, the heart of the nation, the heart of their families, is actually a quote given by a woman who actually died shortly after we conducted an interview, named Joan Youngberg. She was a family leader. She was dying of cancer when we talked, but she wanted to make sure she told me that women are the heart of their nations and their families. And that's the title of my dissertation. Women have always been kinmakers. Historically, women like Buffalo Bird Woman, who's on the left in this photo, and then her sister Cold Medicine on the right. Buffalo Bird Woman's son Ed Goodbird is pictured in the middle there. This is from about 1881. They talk about the ways that their mothers and their grandmothers established their family, that their kinship networks, the ways that women teach girls to be part of their family, the ways that families are related and have always been related not only to their human relatives, but their other than human relatives, like the Missouri River, the animals, their homes are lodges themselves. How important women are to constructing these relationships and continuing them. How women built relationships with other nations by adopting members from other nations, whether symbolically during trade negotiations or in reality when people were left orphaned from a neighbor nation or were taken in a raid by an enemy nation and then were brought to the Hidatsa villages or Mandan villages, when those children being brought into community in relationship, most famously Sacagawea and her sisters, who either were Hidatsa who had been captured and then brought back, or were Shoshone and were adopted by the Hidatsa. The Hidatsa claim that they are always Hidatsa, and that seems to be supported by a lot of family evidence as well as some archaeological evidence. The Shoshone say Shoshone. I'm not getting into the middle of that debate. Both are true in a lot of ways because of this adoption network. Women have always built their family relationships. And this continues with women like Alice Spotted Bear, who is the second female tribal chair of the MHA, who's no longer with us, and her granddaughter, Barry Rose Hallam. Alice always made sure that Barry Rose knew about her culture. Barry Rose and Alice are both from generations where Mandan speaking is no longer the norm. If you look on Wikipedia, up until very recently, it's changed within the last couple months, that it said that the Mandan language was extinct. That is not true. I've met many Mandan speakers, but it's not for want of trying. Indigenous languages were banned at boarding schools. They were persecuted by Bureau of Indian Affairs agents. They were trying to be stopped. Because if you speak your language, you maintain your culture. And if the US government system was built on taking away people's culture and trying to make them act white, because white and Anglo-American culture equals civilized in the US government's mind for years and years and years. So Alice's parents spoke Mandan, but they didn't teach her and her siblings because they didn't want her to be physically hurt at school for speaking Mandan like they had. But then in her older age, there were language reclamation projects going on. So Barry Rose talks about driving around when her grandma was tribal chair, going to different communities. These communities are hundreds of miles apart in different directions. 70 miles is like a short drive on the reservation. She would put in language learning tapes, and Alice and Barry Rose would practice Mandan together and learn Mandan together. To the point that Barry Rose is a Mandan language teacher. Actually, when we meet on Wednesday, we're reading in between her Mandan language classes. She's younger than me. Barry Rose is now a leader in language work today because her grandmother prioritized language teaching as she was learning. She also made sure her granddaughter was learning and can continue to build those relationships through language. Historically, all the way back, time immemorial, in Mandan language and in culture, and bringing that forward. And Barry Rose continues that teaching and that kinship building. Some key points from this. The bands and clans continue to be extremely important to Mandan identity. People still know what clans they're part of, they still know what bands they're part of, and these mark their kinship relationships. These relationships are built through committed relationships. We often use the term marriage, although that's a kind of a loaded term. It has lots of Christian overlays, and not all of these were committed relationships through ceremony. Some of these were hookups that might last forever, might last a season, and that's okay because people had agency over their own bodies and their relationships, or adoption, and that this kinship is essential, especially in times of crisis, whether it's language lost today and building relationships like the language building with Barry Rose and with Alice, or through points of catastrophe. During the 1837 smallpox epidemic, 90% of the Mandan died. About 2/3 of the Hidatsa died, because when you're living in community, when you're living with extended families in a home, there's no way to quarantine. We saw that during COVID. Having to social distance, now imagine if you're living in a home with 50 people. How do you social distance with something as contagious as smallpox and as deadly as smallpox? On top of previous measles epidemics, smallpox epidemics, chickenpox epidemics, etc., as well as a weakened system of food because of the introduction of rats and the destruction of crops as a result. But after the epidemic, elders write about how there was no one left orphaned, because whether you were a child or an adult, if you didn't have family members to care for you, either other members of your clan would adopt you and bring you into their home and their community, or related clans would adopt you, and sometimes even between nations, so that everyone would know who they are, who their family is, and then no one would be left orphaned. My second chapter moves out from that essential family system to looking at their homes and communities themselves. Women are the primary constructors of homes, of earth lodges. Earth lodges are the primary dwelling historically of Mandan and Hidatsa folks, and they're extremely culturally significant because the earth lodge mirrors the world. In Mandan and Hidatsa epistemologies, worldviews, the world is an earth lodge. The sky that protects us outwards is like the dome of the earth lodge. The Missouri River and the communities where people live are the center, like the hearth in the middle. And then the plains that spread out in all directions are like the room around it. This world's lodge is reflected in the ways that people can construct their homes. These earth lodges were spaces where intergenerational families would live, grandparents, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, parents all together. People would have kind of their own cubby space along the edge with beds. Children would be allowed to play and be looked after. The hearth itself was built in 2 steps, where the fire was in the middle and there was an outer area where you could do your cooking, designed in the shape of after a rainbow, but circling all around, as a way to protect children from the fire, so that if a child would stumble or be playing and would fall, they would fall into that outer ring to be saved rather than going into the fire, as once again a mirror of the larger world. And then when a young couple would be married, either the husband would join his wife's lodge, or sometimes the families would build a separate lodge, kind of almost like extension added onto the main lodge for young couples or for elders who needed extra care, because there wasn't an idea of like a nursing home or a spot where all elders went. You would add on to your home and care for your elders in that space. These lodges were openly destroyed by the US government to try to force people to build cabins and to build homes that looked more like Western homes, things with sharp edges instead of the round, because these earth lodges were seen as too indigenous or too pagan because of their beliefs. Literally when people were put onto allotments, we'll talk more about the Dawes Act next week, when people were basically told to move away from these united communities to different individual farms on the reservation, they just literally tore down the lodges so that people couldn't go back to their homes. But the joke was on them, people didn't stop building earth lodges, and even though many people started living in cabins and square buildings, they incorporated the structure of an earth lodge into their cabins. They put their wood-burning stoves in the middle because that keeps the whole house warmer than putting it against a wall and heating a wall out that's going to be next to the blizzard of winter. They continue to live communally and families. And women like Scattered Corn and Mrs. Sitting Crow, I wish I had her first name, I don't in any of the records, they're pictured down here below, built an earth lodge on the North Dakota state capitol grounds in the 1920s to show that Mandan and Hidatsa people were still part of North Dakota. And this is significant because not only have these lodges been banned pretty much on the reservation, but this was part of a North Dakota houses display that also had a homesteader's cabin, it had a soddy, it had Theodore Roosevelt, the president's cabin, from when he had the Maltese Cross. And today, women like Diane Hall and people like Corey Spotted Bear build modern day earth lodges. They're round homes, they're built out of concrete, not earth, but they follow the same construction as an earth lodge. They have communal space. They have the lean-to to act as kind of an airlock coming in. They're geothermally heated with heat pumps from the ground. They have a skylight to be open during the summer to let heat out, can be closed during the winter. This is a project called Livingstone Lodges. And they are being built not only as personal homes and ways to drive employment on the reservation, but also as elders housing, building a complex of them together so that when elders do need extra living assistance, they can live in ways that are culturally relevant. I also look at how women have pushed back against colonialism through the ways that they garden. The United States tried to get people to stop growing crops in indigenous ways, stop planting crops together in relationship, corn growing with beans around it to use the corn as a trellis, squash going across the ground to block out the weeds, and sunflowers around the edge as a fence and a windbreak. Instead, they wanted deep till agriculture, because that was the Anglo-American thing to do. That's what worked on the East Coast, so of course that's going to work on the Great Plains, neglecting the fact that the Great Plains only have about 3 inches of topsoil. And the Indian agents were told by Washington, I have the actual records from the BIA on this, or the OIA, Office of Indian Affairs at the time, that they said that if they need to plow 11 inches deep, 9 to 11 inches deep. There's no topsoil at that point. Women like Buffalo Bird Woman called this out in their interviews. They say, we think our old ways of gardening are better than new ways. We never gardened up here on the top lands. We always gardened down by the river where there was new silt every flood season so that it was fertile ground. But instead they tell us to dig the land deep and garden up here. That's not going to work. This interview was conducted in 1916. I don't know how good your guys' historical knowledge is. In 1926, the Dust Bowl started in North Dakota because of how deep everyone had tilled the ground once there was drought and high winds and all of the crops and the grasses died off. We suddenly had the clouds of dust that started long before the actual depression started. Buffalo Bird Woman was right. That deep till agriculture was destroying the ground. But at industrial fairs, which were supposed to promote this Anglo-American gardening, at state fairs, at corn shows, Mandan and Hidatsa women brought crops that were grown in Hidatsa and Mandan ways, including Buffalo Bird Woman. At the 1911 industrial fair, Buffalo Bird Woman won the corn growing contest both at the Fort Berthold Reservation and at the state fair with corn grown in Hidatsa ways. She didn't even bother to go herself. She sent them with her son, who was on the fair committee. So she's not in any of the pictures, but she still won. And today, Bernadine Youngbird, who's a professor at the Tribal College, continues to promote gardening, both of modern crops as well as historical crops at Argadi Damaguts, Returning to Our Gardens project, in which students learn how to grow crops in Hidatsa and Mandan ways, and how to do that in support of their communities in areas that are food deserts, that have very few shops or spots to get healthy food. Instead, students are being taught how to garden in ways that their great-great-grandmothers have, and in ways to support their families, and it's made a huge difference to food access on the reservation. click through. I also look at how people make spaces within settler spaces, because history is not stagnant. Change is normal. People have always been adapting. The Hidatsa did not always grow corn. They learned how to do that from the Mandan when they moved along the Missouri River. The Mandan and Hidatsa did not always hunt with guns. They hunted with bows and arrows like most other people. But then guns were introduced and manufactured arrowheads, and people kind of forgot how to make flint arrowheads for a while, because why make a flint arrowhead if you can buy some from French traders? Adaptation happens, and that's not a bad thing. Settler spaces like the Congregational Church, different reservations were given to different church entities to be looked after and to be quote unquote civilized. Congregational Church was assigned to Fort Berthold. The missionaries came in wanting to convert everyone to Christianity by replacing their religion, came in wanting to change the way that they dress, the way that they act. Fort Berthold did not see converting to Christianity in the same way. In fact, Hall, C.L. Hall, the missionary, did not have a single convert for 11 years because he came in telling people that they couldn't be both indigenous and Christian. That is fundamentally untrue. And everyone saw it. Once he finally started to have success with people being Christians, because people saw this as an opportunity. Let's go to the school and learn English, because then we can catch when the agency is trying to cheat us out of our allotments, or cheat us out of our annuities. Wolf Chief, a man who learned English first from a relative who was English or an American trader who had married one of his cousins, and then later had kind of polished up his English and his math skills at Hall's day schools, actually caught the agent not only cheating on annuities, but stealing annuities to sell them at his brother's store. Wrote to Washington, was labeled like a delinquent Indian or a hostile Indian as a result for a while. All that in quotes for those of you who can't see my quotes. And ended up getting that agent fired. It's one of the only cases I can find of an agent actually being fired for impropriety, because he knew how to write in English, and he kept his literal receipts of how things were going. Wolf Chief also was a congregational minister, because the Mandan and Hidatsa people did not see Christianity as opposed to their culture. You can be both Christian and indigenous. Churches were constructed that could also act as community buildings during the week. You could participate in ceremony and honor your ancestors, honor the greater world, but also believe in Jesus. Those things are not diametrically opposed, to the point that the only Anglo entity that advocated for the Fort Berthold community against the Garrison Dam in the 1950s was the Congregational Church. So after Hall's assimilation agenda was done, another pastor, Reverend Case, came. After about a year of trying to be Hall's prodigy, keep up that assimilation, he noticed, we're neighbors. Why am I telling my neighbor to live in a way that doesn't fit them? And why is my idea superior to theirs? It's not. So instead supported people in the ways that they lived, and ended up being one of the strongest advocates to this day. There's still a UCC, Congregational Church merged in with the United Church of Christ. Continues to be UCC churches on the reservation today. Even during Hall's time, things that were meant to teach people to be white, like sewing circles, teaching women to sew English dresses, became spots where women could continue to speak their language when it was banned, and teach their daughters and granddaughters how to bead, how to do quill work. They adapted Anglo patterns to be shorter, to be worn with leggings, or to incorporate aspects of beadwork. Even ceremonial things. I have a photo of White Buffalo Cow Society, which is one of it's the Elders Society for Women. That would do dances to call the buffalo near the villages in the winter when you couldn't be going out on the prairies to hunt because it's blizzarding. I have a hat from a woman in the 20s. It's at North Dakota Historic Society. I have the photo where not only is it the traditional hat with the grouse feathers and things, but there's a bright purple feather because she must have liked purple, and there was a big craze around purple feathers in the early 1900s. And you know what? It's her most important belonging. She decided to add one of her favorite feathers into that hat. That doesn't make it any less sacred. It makes it an adaptation. Today, the Women's Ladies Auxiliary for the American Legion is extremely important. In fact, the Ladies Auxiliaries have been ways for Mandan and Hidatsa women to continue to practice their ceremonies that were literally outlawed for over 50 years by the United States government because all indigenous religion was outlawed. Women were able to take their ceremonies of supporting soldiers, of caring for families of people that died in war, and carrying that over into the auxiliary, where women continue to dance today, the same dances that they have historically. That's what I thought. Dance historically, and continue to honor veterans. Only now, in addition to ribbon skirts and shawls, they're the yellow and the blue of the Ladies Auxiliary. And in fact, this weekend, the Antelope Society, which is a Sonish Society, and the Ladies Auxiliary are hosting the Little Shell Powwow on Thursday, Fridays, and Saturday to honor veterans as well as to bring community together and to honor one of the communities that was flooded by the Garrison Dam. Women continue to be important leaders spiritually and in these settler spaces, and with that resilience. They also continue to create futures. I've talked a lot about the Garrison Dam. This image is often zoomed in to see Harry Gillette crying. It's often not shown in its entirety, where the senators, this is them signing the law for the Pix Loan Project. That would destroy 90% of the reservation's land. Almost all of the agricultural land was flooded, most of the communities were. The white senators, there were women that spoke to them, there were men that spoke to them. When a woman spoke to them about how much harm was going to be done to the agriculture and to women's industry, their only question was, what does a buffalo berry taste like? It was answered by a white senator, not by the woman who had presented. They didn't care. Construction had already started on the dam. But women rebuilt their communities, just like they had after smallpox, just like they had after allotment. They rebuilt their communities. They funded road construction and bridge construction. People could get from one side of the reservation across the dam so that people could continue to see their relatives and continue to be together. And women continue to advocate. Women like Ruth Buffalo, who is a representative from Fargo-Moorhead area, who is a Hidatsa community member, sponsored a bill, and many other Indigenous women sponsored a bill that now recently made it so that all K-12 education needs to include Indigenous history and Indigenous histories of people from North Dakota. When I grew up in North Dakota and South Dakota, even when I lived on reservation, I did not have any Indigenous history. No one even thought about asking one of my friends' grandmas to come in and tell us their history. Now it is required, and in addition to the requirement, elders have made curriculum that include oral histories, include stories, include work projects and things so that teachers can be trained to teach this history. Similar work is just starting here in Minnesota with the passing of a similar bill last year, the year before. I'm actually going to be working as a program assistant with some of that training this next year. Women continue to be advocates in their lives and for their communities. And what you'll see if you want the larger dissertation is that this leadership is only continuing. So as I'm being told we're at our end, because I knew we would be, you can come up and tell me individually before we have to run to church. But next week I'm going to be presenting on Minnesota history, or more general history. What would you all like to know more about? And I've talked a lot of you.